I don't understand. This is coming on. Let me just click it. Right. Good evening, everybody. My name's Peter Pedersen, and next to me is Sandra Kruger, educational psychology lecturer. We see these people here from Rehoboth and then also from Salt River. Right, I'm going to hand over to Sandra Kruger now.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm glad we have a bigger crowd than what we had last time. So please join in discussions and use the chat to discuss. Once again, thank you for sending your assignments, and I think we can go to the PowerPoint and then we can follow through with that.
Sorry, just before we go through the PowerPoint, please will you just use group chat for any interaction? It'll just make it a bit easier. Right.
Just next one.
No.
No, doesn't want to go. There we go. Right. Just welcome once again, and just an overview of what we'll be covering. I'll be giving feedback for assignment 2, and it appears that there are sort of silly mistakes that I think once you've dealt with that, your marks will soar far more so, other than putting in more effort into the actual learning material. So please look at those very carefully, because they tend to be unnecessary errors or omissions within your assignments. I will discuss assignment 3 in detail for you, because there are a number of issues that you need to bear in mind. And just a tip, if you do a lot of reading and preparation for this assignment, you've virtually done the work for your 4th assignment. So please read. It does give you more of a cohesive sense of the material as well if you read around the topic. And please, I've given the reading material previously, but you access your 2 textbooks, and that will help you and support you through the construction of your assignments. And then I'll just discuss barriers of learning, just to give you a background for your interview, and then for the forum discussion as well, and then we'll end off. So we can go on to just feedback for your assignment. Once again, thank you for submitting. Please, if you're unable to make the due date, let me know in advance the reason, and if I could help you perhaps with issues, it will just make life easier for yourself. Also remember to include your honor pledge. I think this time around I had 3 honor pledges and only 1 or 2 had the actual signature. It's meaningless without your signature, so your name printed is not a valid honor pledge. Then please also proofread and spell check your work. And there are a few instances where I could pick up cut and paste practice in your assignments, and then it tends to be not a good flow of the information or fragmented information. I understand you sometimes pressured for time, but please look at that. If you're going to cut and paste, that what you have there makes sense and there's a logical flow of the information. And then once again, also look at your referencing techniques. I am quite strict on that, in the sense that you are postgraduate students and we do expect scholarly work from our students. It's also the reputation of our institution, and I'm sure you want that to be good. Then also use the rubric and pointers. There were a number of students who lost marks because they did not cover all the relevant elements within the assignments. Also try and include resources other than the internet resource. Try and get hold of those textbooks. They will be worthwhile on your bookshelf in the long run, but also just to actually have consolidated information. We cannot always trust internet information, and also it comes from sources that you actually do not know where. There were a number of resources that said anonymous, and you actually want scholarly work. And then also try and avoid slang language in your assignments. I know I always fall in that trap in terms of a lot, sometimes things, and those words that we use, but try and use more academic language. use headings. It will help you to proofread and also ensure that you've covered all the points without reading the whole assignment in detail, and that would guide you as well. And then just be careful in terms of using terminology. I picked up quite a number of you called metacognition a strategy. It's actually a cognitive skill, so it's not a strategy. You will use strategies to promote or enhance or elicit metacognition skills of children. So it's not a strategy. Strategy is something that you use to bring out the learning or improve the knowledge from with a child. So look at those issues. On to the next one, your assignment 3. Just more information in terms of your preparation for that assignment. I hope by now that you have made appointments with either teachers or parents. If not, please do that right as soon as possible, and perhaps have a fallback, a plan B, if one person cannot perhaps support you in this whole process, that you do have a fallback to go to complete this assignment. The assignment is that you need to interview a teacher in the intermediate phase and a parent in the intermediate phase with regards to the understanding and perceptions of inclusion education. And I'll go through those in detail. So your background information here is that you need to know what inclusive education is all about, and then obviously the barriers of learning. So look at a definition for inclusive education, and then look at the barriers of learning. And in the next slide, you are required to ask 5 questions of the interviewee. You can pull up 2 sets of questions, one for the teacher, one set for the teacher, and the other set for the parent. I think just the nature of a parent versus an educator, you will phrase your questions slightly different. There might be similar questions because you want to correlate information, but look at your language and also how you phrase your questions for the different partners in this process. You need to gain their understanding and insight. For example, a parent's understanding and insight might be different from a teacher's in the sense of how they perceive how, for example, a special need is provided for in a school or not. And then part of the assignment would be that you would comment on their responses. You would not do that obviously immediately within the interview, but that would be after you've recorded the answers. You would need to go and analyze and then in a scholarly manner respond to those questions, and I'll cover that a little bit later. And then also look at perhaps how you might guide them. Obviously you're not in a counseling session with parents, so understand that also. You're not there to solve their problems, so try and steer away from that, but you might guide them in terms of perhaps reading or encourage them to go and speak to their teacher to perhaps clarify a point or a problem that they are struggling with. Once you've secured the interview, establish the specific barriers, and the actual barrier of the learner will guide your type of questions that you will ask in the interview and will give your assignment your specific style. So you might not all cover the same barrier to learning, but the underlying principles will hold true for all of you. And then also you can start doing background information in terms of the school's policies that guides inclusive education in the school and how it's provided for, supported, or addressed within the school. I would advise you perhaps to try and find a school, either the school that you're working in or a school that you've done pracs at, that you're a little bit more familiar with the whole setup at that specific school. Your assignment will consist of, it's actually 4 components, not 3, but I see the questionnaire as a separate addendum. So once you've written your assignment, please attach your questionnaire to the assignment. And then what I have not put there, also your permission slip to do this research in the school. I've got that a little bit later, but not on this specific slide. So remember, a letter of permission where you actually ask for permission and where the permission is granted to you to actually go into the school and conduct the interviews. Then once again, as for all assignments, an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So look at those aspects very carefully as well.
I don't know if there are any questions that you want to raise at this point. If there are, I suggest you just use group chat if you want some clarification, something you're not sure about. This might be a good time to ask Sandra. We'll just pause for a minute and to see if there's any questions you want to raise.
Okay. Shall we go on? There will be time at the end as well if you want to ask questions. Just an example of how you can construct your actual interview. For example, you'll have a question for the interview, and also don't use their real names. Use a pseudonym or interviewee A and interviewee B. For example, a question that you could ask is, what is your opinion or experience of how the school approached a specific challenge? So if, say, for example, the child is hearing impaired, you could ask, how did the school deal with the child that is hearing impaired? For parents, it might be that they would respond, I've received tremendous support from the school. Prompt them a little bit if they've given you sort of very vague questions, and this is where your background reading will come to your advantage, because you will know what the support should be. And then in your students' comments after the interview, you will write a little bit more structured information in terms of the appropriateness of the support, what was lacking, what was perhaps unique and special in that specific school that came to the fore. And that all adds to your knowledge and obviously skill as teachers in a later process. Be careful to, in terms of your prompting, so before your interview, actually look at your questions very carefully and how you might prompt a parent. Also be careful that parents might become overwhelmed. Give them a moment to recompose themselves, or stop the interview, and you can always restart at a later stage. Parents with children who are experiencing learning barriers, for them sometimes it can become an overwhelming exercise to open up to relatively a stranger. So bear that in mind, be guarded in their answers as well. And then in terms of, I've just given you, for example, here in appropriateness of support, you would look at support for the learner, support from the school, support from the teacher, and always in the background consider the micro, meso, and macro situations. For example, what a meso situation would be the school policy. Macro situation would be the government's provisioning. So what does a white paper state in terms of barriers of learning? And on a macro level, what is the teacher actually doing in her classroom? One teacher might deal with it better than another teacher in terms of either experience or class numbers smaller. So look at all those background factors, and that's where your reading will come to the fore in this assignment. So although you're concentrating on one aspect of barriers of learning, your background information, this is where this will come to the fore in the assignment. And I think this is where you will need to ponder the most, and I expect where most of your reading will center around as well. So look at those very carefully. We can come back to that a little bit later if there are questions in terms of that. Just a few pointers in terms of an interview protocol. it's a professional approach. So depending on how well you perhaps know a teacher in the school, you could approach her or him initially, but ultimately it has to go through the principal with a written request to conduct the interviews. Give them the purpose of the interview. It's part of a very small research project towards your qualification in the ADT. Also ensure them of your confidentiality in terms of all issues discussed. Try and get assigned permission with the school. Most principals are very easy to get that from. And if you have the signed permission, attach that to your assignment as well, a copy of that to your assignment as well. And then also arrange the venue, obviously in collaboration with the teacher and or the principal of the school. Confirm the appointment and try and confirm it at least a week in advance so that you are comfortable and you don't arrive there on the date and they've left on a holiday or something, so that your plan B can kick in appropriately. Also thank your interviews in the school afterwards and give them perhaps some feedback in a sense, and it can be very short in the sense of you welcome the feedback, it added to your understanding, it's made it more realistic, and you will be better equipped as a teacher to deal with these issues. A thank you could be in the form of just a thank you note to both the teacher and the parent. Do that, it's part of a professional conduct as well. Remember, as I said before, it is a professional interview, it's not a friendly chat, and also you are not the guidance counselor. Although you might have skills in that area, this is not the purpose of this specific assignment. And if parents are uncomfortable, don't push a question, but perhaps have reserved questions at hand that you could draw from, so that you're not sitting there and you don't know how to go further with the actual interview because you've used up your initial 5 questions. Right. In terms of preparing, I've given you some reading to do. Those are your prescribed books. And number 2 is the education white paper. It's also available on the education website, so you don't have to go and search for that. And if you go onto the education website and just do a Google search in terms of barrier of learning, you'll find tremendous amount of literature for them. I will, during the course of tomorrow, post 3 articles for you from a South African perspective as well. Another book that I find very useful is 4 from Professor Kapp from Stellenbosch University. We basically discuss each barrier of learning in detail, giving you causes, etc. So if you're very interested in that field, that would be a useful book to get as well. I have more here, Peter. Do I just... Right. Just some reading for you to do there in terms of giving you some background information into the assignment. Just remember, once again, you need to look at small factors like what happens in the classroom to basically more bigger factors in terms of government provision. Look at the curriculum. How's CAPS implemented, and does it really allow you to cater for children with learning needs within your school? Most teachers will comment that the curriculum is so full and the assessment is so demanding that they actually don't have time, and especially if there's more than one child with learning barriers in the school. So that's perhaps a question that you could ask teachers as well in terms of how do they cope if they have more than one, or how have they in the past coped with more than one child in the school. And also depending on the level of the barrier, it can become problematic for teachers. So look at that very carefully. Also define the concepts of inclusive education and barriers to learning in terms of your introduction to your assignment. Always within an assignment there should be an introduction where you give a brief overview of what the actual important information of this assignment is all about, and those definitions you'll find within those readings that I've given you. So go and look at that. And then also keywords for inclusive education. Look at the difference between what's a mainstream school, what's a school that integrates, and what does true inclusive education really mean, and is the general understanding under that concept. In terms of barriers of learning, try and find a universal definition for what is barriers of learning, and then consider the different types of barriers and level, and then also what should be best practice if the school goes the road of inclusion. About 10 years ago, the government closed most of these special schools down, which meant that for most of these learners, they had to be accommodated within the school system. One of the articles that I will post for you is inclusive education in independent schools, and perhaps have a read there and make a comparison in terms of provision in government schools, independent schools if you wish. But look at what should be best practice and what happens in reality in terms of this context. I'm just going to go through a little bit more background information just to give you a kickstart in terms of the assignment, and also to give you sort of a perspective of what you need to look at. These are the 4 main categories or types of barriers to learning. It's the terminology that the Western Cape Education Department uses more often, but you will find other similar terminologies for it. So systemic barriers, which basically reverts back to planning issues, logistic issues, and I'll cover that in a little bit more detail. Societal barriers, in some literature they would also refer to it as an environmentally deprived children. So how does the environment impact on that? And we will unpack that just now. And then also pedagogical barriers, and sometimes it's deemed as educational barriers or didactically neglected child. So look at those. And then what most of us are familiar with are the so-called medical barriers. It's those children with, for example, autism, spina bifida, cerebral palsy, etc. But I'll go and look at that as well. So once you've identified the specific barrier that you're going to deal with in your interview, locate it in one of these categories so that you can look at the supporting background information that should be in place to provide for that specific barrier in the school. For example, with some of these barriers, a lot depends on school policies or government policies. Others are more social welfare issues, but how does it impact on the school? And that would obviously give you different factors to consider within your assignment. Systemic barriers, just to give you a few examples. It might be a school where there's a lack of basic and appropriate learning support materials, so a school that's under-resourced. Or I've been in schools when I was lecturing and evaluating students where the new equipment is locked up because it mustn't get messed up, because when the inspector comes, those equipment is brought out for the learners. So for most of the time it's not even accessed, although it is there, so it's perhaps not a lack of, but not used appropriately within the school. Look also at a lack of assistive devices. Those could be perhaps writing boards. In schools nowadays, children have iPads, etc. as a communicative tools that has been used very successfully. So look at those. It could also even be TV programs. I'm sure you've seen on TV lately, there's a school in Botswana where a teacher has used the Mnet learning programs to the advantage of his children, in terms of that his children were environmentally deprived children, and he's enriched the environment in terms of those programs in his school. Also look at facilities at a school, for example, speciality classrooms like an IT lab or science lab, or perhaps just a properly equipped classroom where children can sit comfortably and do their work, and they're not cold, or there's a wind going through the classroom and they're not protected from the elements. Also look at overcrowded classrooms. Legislation has just come through that has actually for the first time really given a number, and at the moment it's 40 learners per classroom, and it's linked to the size of the classroom. Previously it was not linked to size of a classroom, so look at those issues as well. And then also very much debated point is lack of mother tongue educators, so look at those aspects as well. And obviously there are more factors in terms of systemic barriers, and that you will pick up in your reading, so you can add to this specific list. Societal barriers, I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them might be easily identified with the school, in a school, others might not be so easily identified. Some of them are also, there's a sort of conflict whether it does belong within this category or not. For example, a lack of intervention program, is that a didactical barrier or is it a societal barrier? So that those are issues that you can also ponder on and give comment on. Although bullying is not explicitly mentioned as a societal barrier within a school, perhaps consider this as well and give your opinions you might have that the child is bullied because of the so-called barrier that the child is experiencing, or perhaps a child that is where it's just bullying. So look at those issues as well within a school. Look at violence in the school. And also violence within the neighbourhood of the school, and in the Western Cape we surely have examples of those that you can perhaps look at as background information. Natural disasters might seem as an odd factor in terms of societal barriers, but perhaps look at where there's been a flood and children cannot get to a school and how that impacts on the society in terms of schooling. There is also lately, about 2-3 weeks ago in the news, roads that have not been built quick enough in the Northern Cape, and where children actually cannot get to the school due to the roads not being completed. So that could also be a logistic issue, a macro issue in terms of government provisioning, so consider those issues as well. Educational barriers or pedagogical barriers, once again a long list of aspects, some of them that you might identify quite easily, like a curriculum that is very rigid, but for example the last one, school ethos, which is actually a very soft factor, that but it can impact tremendously on a school. So perhaps if you have identified your school, go and see what their motto is and what their core values are within the school, and that would perhaps give you an indication of how they also provide them for children with learning barriers within the school. And yeah, look at how the content is taught. We all know what the content should be in terms of CAPS, but look at how it is actually managed and delivered to children within the school context. Medical barriers, and I think this is the bulk of our barriers to learning. Once again, it's not an exhaustive list, so please add to this. Very firstly, the subcategories of sensory disabilities I've mentioned too there, but there are more barriers of learning. If you think of your child that is tactile defensive as well, so you can add those. Neurological disabilities, your cerebral palsy child, your epileptic child, and then a whole range of learning disabilities. Some categorization of these barriers of learning might be slightly different depending on who you are reading. So that's not the major issue, it's just that they cover it somewhere. Also look at children that are, the very last one there, dysemic, which is basically children who do not like or cannot perceive how to act within a group. They don't know how to introduce himself into group, be friends with children, etc. And obviously that could also have problems. Sometimes, once again, it's a standalone problem, but within certain barriers of learning, that is one of the compounding aspects within the learning problem as well. Let's go to the next category, physical disabilities. Once again, a whole range of, and I've got cancer there with the asterisks. In some literature, it's under physical disabilities, and under literature, it is under the so-called medical or chronically ill category. So once again, however you want to categorize it, that makes sense for you. Once again, a whole range, and you can add to that list in terms of once you've completed all your reading. And then the last one is the cognitive disabilities, where basically we look at low cognitive functioning children, for example, your Down syndrome child, but also be aware that you could have high functioning Down syndrome children and children who do not exhibit the classic Down syndrome characteristics, and they can be, but although they have Down syndrome, but they are high functioning. Then also look at your high functioning learners, which we tend to also neglect in the school system because they're not troublesome, they're not difficult, and we tend to overlook them, so look at that. And then in terms of autistic behavior, a subcategory of autistic behavior is the so-called Asperger's syndrome, where those children tend to be high functioning, but they obviously have social problems and communication problems as compounding factors, so look at those. And then once again, just be aware in all of these categories you might have that there's more than one compounding factor on a barrier of learning. It might be a child with multiple barriers of learning as well, so be aware of those.
Can I just suggest you just pause here for a moment? I don't know if you students want to make any comments or want to ask Sandra any questions. Just use the group chat or unmute yourselves and you can ask questions. We'll just pause for a moment.
We're technically at the end, so yeah, so if you have questions, it's a lot to digest in one sitting, and I think once you start reading as well, you'll have more questions. Let's go then, wait 5 minutes. Shall we go on, and then if at the end, if you have questions, we can revisit those again. Just a warning from my side, start reading early, especially the textbooks, so that you actually are well prepared and it's not a rush at the end, and you'll feel more comfortable during your interviews. And then also just following on, those are the assignments and tutorials that we will still cover up. And the good news is we're halfway through the module. So you can relax halfway, but not completely. And once again, thank you. I'm really enjoying the interaction and also going through your assignments. And believe it or not, I'm also learning from them. We'll wait 5 minutes before we actually end off this broadcast if you do have questions, but you're also welcome to contact me afterwards via email, or you can contact me telephonically. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening. We'll wait for about 5 minutes if there are questions. Right, it doesn't seem like there's any questions, but you're most welcome to email me. But if I can really urge you, start reading. It is quite a bit of reading. I think in the previous PowerPoint, I've given you the actual chapters in the textbooks to go and look at. But please, and I'll post the other articles for you tomorrow. So get going with those. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good evening. Bye.